Book time. So obviously, reading books is important, especially if you're a writer, because you learn by writing. I can't tell you how many writers I've actually run into that say, "Oh no, I don't read books." Usually you can tell by the quality of the writing if they don't read. So, I'm not the best at staying on top of reading. I've actually been struggling with it, and there's a second benefit I think to reading regularly, past reading, and it helps to increase your attention span. I think one of the big things that I've been struggling with reading is that I can't focus long enough to get through like 20 pages. So when I'm sitting there and I'm cognizant of it, I make myself read through a certain number of pages and or for a certain amount of time. And when I feel that itch to go and do something else, I go, no, I'm going to read the book, stick with the page, do not touch that other device or whatever else you were going to do. So last month I got through 4 books. One of them was a very hefty book, and that's the one that we're going to start with. It was The Stranger Beside Me by Anne Rule, and this is, if you can't tell, a book about Ted Bundy. Anne Rule was actually a woman that met Ted when he was in college, and they were working at a crisis hotline center. That's right, Ted Bundy used to answer the phones at a crisis hotline center, and he was apparently very good at it. And he also offered Anne Rule a bit of compassion with her own life when she was having issues, because they would kind of talk back and forth, though she was more forthcoming with personal information than he was, for obvious reasons. I highly recommend this book if you're interested in Ted Bundy. It goes through a lot of his life from the perspective of somebody who knew him before he got infamous for killing, who knew him as a friend, and who mostly considered him a friend up until the end. What's really interesting to me is, so the book ends, and then there's an epilogue, and then there's a 20 years later epilogue. And the first epilogue takes place, by takes place, I mean she wrote it, the year that Ted Bundy was actually supposed to be executed. And then one of the years he was supposed to be executed, like, he had like 11 calls for execution, 10 of which were called off, and then the 11th, postponed. And then the 11th, they just pulled it. So, I think that first time is when he actually got his first, okay, this is your date to die, and then she wrote it a couple weeks before that. Correction, there are 3 ending things. The second one is the year that he died, 1989, and then the third one says 20 years later, and I'm assuming it's 20 years since the book was published. So you've got those 3 closers. And the interesting thing for me in reading those is that Anne Rule got a lot more bitter through those last 20 years. For most of the book, she had compassion, and even in that first foreword at the end, that was in 1986, she said, to condemn him to death would mean that he cannot be healed, and we've failed a human being, and we cannot help him. And by 20 years later, she goes, there was nothing left for him here. He couldn't offer anything to the world, and there was nothing the world could offer him. And you can find the anger, so much anger, and especially that last 20 chapters, it feels like duped, betrayed, which, reasonable. And her compassion for him was completely gone. And I understand wanting to treat somebody like him with compassion. But also, when you just approach it with anger, you don't find the reasons behind the actions. And that's one of the reasons I like reading these books, is I like to understand people and understand the choices that they make and why they did the things they did. And I think you get a lot of Ted's personality in here, and you get to see a lot of him as a person, but you also get to see a lot of manipulative tactics. It doesn't focus on Ted in some parts, because it's from her perspective what she was doing at times and where Ted came in and out and when she heard about Ted. So some of it is just focused on what she was doing at that time, and then when Ted came in and out, or when she heard about news of Ted. And sometimes he didn't call her for years. I think there was a decade in there that he didn't call her. But you get a lot of information about his escapes, about him staying in the 2 prisons, about a lot of his legal battles. It doesn't go into so much detail about the crimes, only enough detail that you know about what was used in court mostly, or that what was happening at the time. But it doesn't talk details about the crimes, so if you don't like hearing about gore or any of that, this is a good book to read for Ted Bundy, because you won't have to deal with any of that. It's also very interesting because they put a good, with every fiction or with every nonfiction, they always put pictures in there. What's interesting about Ted is he's described by Anne Rule as a chameleon, and he can change his appearance kind of on a dime. And if you look at the pictures in this book, they're all so different. And something that was really cool for me was looking at those pictures and not having a context, and then as you read through the story, you get context to put over those pictures, and it's really neat. So I highly recommend it. It is a really long book, as you can see, but it is worth the read. Something that I took away from it, so Anne Rule says that he was so Anne Rule kind of implies that Ted was inhuman, or, he was completely detached from humanity, and there was no helping him, and there was no normal person inside of him. But Ted actually had a daughter while he was in jail, and he apparently showed protective qualities of the daughter. He cared for the daughter's well-being, and if a person can show care and affection in whatever way that they have to their own child, it means that there's some humanity inside of them. They're not completely detached, which gives me hope. She did not have so much hope at the end, and that's what really hurts my heart, is to have somebody give up hope and that somebody would end up like Ted when it was so promising. Funny side note, Ted's first major in college was actually Chinese, because he was certain in the 1970s that China would end up overtaking the U.S. Commerce market, so he wanted to get ahead of the curve and learn Chinese. So there's that. The second book that I read was Sour Candy by Keenan Patrick Burke, and it's just a short, like a little novella. As you can tell, it's a scary story. And the book starts out, 4 months to the day he first encountered the boy at Walmart, the last of Phil Pendleton's teeth fell out. And if that's not a way to start a story. It's a quick read. It's just, there's some demonic things going on. There's a demonic boy, but it's not super gut-wrenching. I think it's like an easy read. If you're looking for a horror that's kind of just an easy read, without a bunch of emotion behind it, this is it. This was just fun, and it was a good break from some of the other stuff that I have been reading. The third book that I read was The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. He is known as a grandmaster of horror, and did the Pinhead series, and I think this was the first book in that, because it doesn't actually mention Pinhead. And I'm not familiar enough with Pinhead to kind of place the stuff in the greater universe of Pinhead. But it was a fun read. It's also a pretty short read, because the type is pretty big in there. And most of the characters are not likable, but I like the way that he writes, and he's obviously very imaginative in stuff that he comes up with and the way that he wrote. So I really enjoyed his descriptions of his creepy stuff. It was human, she saw, or had been, but the body had been ripped apart and sewn together again, with most of its pieces either missing or twisted and blackened, as if in a furnace. There was an eye gleaming at her, and the ladder of a spine, the vertebrae stripped of muscle, a few unrecognizable fragments of anatomy. That was it. That such a thing might have lived beggared reason. What little flesh it owned was hopelessly corrupted, yet live it did. Its eye, despite the rot it was rooted in, scanned every inch up and down. Freakishly, that creature does have sex with one of the ladies in this book. That's a little disturbing. But I highly recommend that book. It was an entertaining read, And the last book that I read last month was Bret Easton Ellis' Less Than Zero. This is a super depressing book, but it's not a horror. To kind of break away from what's going on over there. This is actually just nihilistic teenagers in California, and it starts with the line, "People are afraid to murder on freeways in Los Angeles." I saw people talking about this book online and saying that that was some metaphorical thing, and I don't do metaphors, so I don't know what the deeper meaning is for that. And Clay, the main character in this book, actually brings it up mentions it a couple of times when he's thinking about stuff. There's prostitution in here, drugs. His California friends rape a 12-year-old girl because why not? That's kind of their whole thing. Is this story is just these people out of control living. Clay is wanting. I feel like Clay is thinking about how his family kind of fell apart and how he doesn't have anything, and there's really no community, and what purpose really is there. And he's disgusted with the stuff he sees, but at the same time, he doesn't know what else there is to do. I'm a really big fan of Bret Easton Ellis. I think he's saucy as a person, and Glamorama is one of my favorite books. And so reading this, it was very depressing. I do like the style. I've seen some people complaining about the simplicity of the style, but the style reads really well and really easy to me. It's just first person. It kind of just continues on, and I don't know. A lot of dialogue, which I like dialogue. So if you want to know more about some, it says unflinching. If you want to read some unflinching depictions of hedonistic youth, its brutal portrayal of the inexorable consequences of such moral depravity, this is the book. It was a very quick read, and I think there's a lot to take away from it as a writer. If you are struggling with your story and you struggle with your style, or you struggle thinking, this is too simple, or I can't use this much dialogue, or I need to do this kind of structure for my paragraphs, I think this is a good way to see that you don't have to do any specific style to be acceptable. And that a more simple style, of a lot of dialogue, and then sometimes you insert some paragraphs for description, and then a lot of dialogue back and forth. He's very good with character. There are some parts in here. It's sad, but it's funny. His dialogue is funny, but his dialogue is sad but funny. There are some parts in here where the kids, they're like 18, 19, 20 maybe. Because most of them have fake IDs when they go to the bar. And there's the parts in here where they're talking about their parents. Hey, what are your parents up to? What are they doing? Shopping in Aspen. They're over in this other place. At least that's what the magazines told me. So they're not even in real contact with some of their parents. They're learning what their parents are up to by what the gossip magazines are doing. It's really sad. And you got this part in here where they're sitting in a car, and by they I mean Clay, his two sisters, and his mom are in a car. And the sister says, "Why do you lock your door anyway, Clay?" I don't say anything. "Why do you lock your door, Clay?" One of them, I don't know which one, asks. I still didn't say anything. I consider grabbing one of the bags from MGA or Camp Beverly Hills or a box of shoes from Privilege and flinging them out the window. "Mom, tell him to answer me. Why do you lock your door, Clay?" I turn around. "Because you both stole a quarter-gram of cocaine from me last time I left my door open, that's why." My sisters don't say anything. Teenage enema nurses in bondage by a group called Killer Pussy comes on the radio, and my mother asks if we have to listen to this, and my sisters tell her to turn it up, and no one says anything else until the song's over. When we get home, my younger sister finally tells me out at the pool, "That's bullshit. I can get my own cocaine." So, I think that interaction is hilarious, but then how he goes from being in the car to later that night, it reads really easy to me, and I think it's really impressive. So, what did you read last month? Tell me in the comments below, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.